You could be doing everything your doctor told you to do, taking the pill every morning, cutting back on the salt shaker, going for your evening walk, and still be getting a number on that home monitor that doesn't match what's actually happening inside your arteries. Not because your body is failing you, because of a handful of small, completely ordinary mistakes that almost nobody explains clearly. Mistakes that happen in your living room, at your kitchen table, and in your medicine cabinet. Some of them take 30 seconds to fix. Others just take knowing they exist in the first place. Stick with me, because at least one of the 7 we're about to walk through is almost certainly happening in your house this week, and by the end, you'll know exactly which one to fix first. If you're over 60, blood pressure probably isn't an abstract number to you anymore. Maybe a parent had a stroke. Maybe your own doctor's office has that little chart taped to the wall that makes you flinch every time you sit in the chair. And if you've ever taken your blood pressure twice in 5 minutes and gotten 2 different answers, you already know how confusing this can feel. You start to wonder if the machine is broken, if you're doing something wrong, or if your body is just unpredictable. Some people quietly stop trusting their monitor altogether after enough of these mismatched readings, which is in some ways the worst outcome of all, because it means walking away from one of the most useful tools you have for staying ahead of a problem. Here's the reassuring part. In most cases, none of those are true. What's usually happening is that blood pressure measurement is far more sensitive to everyday habits than most people are ever told, and a few small missteps can quietly throw off both the numbers you see and how well your treatment actually works. Nobody sits you down when you're handed a home monitor and walks you through the details that actually matter: the posture, the timing, the label reading, the medication questions worth asking. You're expected to just figure it out, and most people never do. It's about understanding a system, your cardiovascular system, and the way it responds to timing, posture, salt, sleep, and medication, well enough to work with it instead of against it. Think of it less like troubleshooting a broken machine and more like learning the quirks of an old, reliable car you've had for decades. It's not failing you. It just responds to certain conditions in ways nobody ever pointed out, and once you know them, everything runs smoother. Let's walk through what's actually going on, one piece at a time, starting with the moment the cuff goes on your arm. Let's start with the moment you actually wrap the cuff around your arm, because this is where a surprising number of bad readings begin. Almost nobody realizes that talking during a reading can raise the number you see by several points. Your body treats conversation as a small physical task, and blood pressure rises to support it, the same way it rises slightly when you climb a flight of stairs. So if you're chatting with a spouse, watching television, or scrolling your phone while the cuff inflates, that reading isn't really measuring your resting blood pressure. It's measuring you mid-multitask. Arm position matters just as much. If your arm is hanging at your side, resting in your lap, or propped on an armrest that's too low, the reading can shift meaningfully compared to having your arm supported at roughly heart height on a table. Crossing your legs while seated does something similar, quietly nudging the number upward. None of this means your monitor is defective. It means blood pressure is a moving target that responds to posture within seconds, and small setup details change what gets recorded. A cuff that's too small for your arm will typically read too high. One that's too large can read too low. Many people buy whatever monitor is on sale without ever checking whether the included cuff actually fits their arm circumference, and then spend months trusting numbers that were off from day one. Which arm you use matters more than most people assume, too. Blood pressure can genuinely differ between your left and right arm, sometimes by a noticeable amount, and switching back and forth between them from one day to the next makes it look like your numbers are swinging wildly when really you're just comparing 2 different measurement points. The recommendation most clinicians give is simple. Figure out which arm reads consistently, or ask your doctor which one they'd like you to use, and stick with that same arm every time so you're always comparing like with like. The fix is simple and doesn't require a new machine in most cases. Sit with your back supported, both feet flat on the floor, arm resting on a table at roughly heart level, cuff sized correctly, and stay quiet for the minute or so the reading takes. Wait 5 minutes after sitting down before you start, and use the average, since a single reading can be thrown off by something as small as a passing noise or a stray thought about your to-do list. This single change in habit, measuring in a consistent, quiet, properly supported position on the same arm every time, is often enough to make weeks of confusing numbers suddenly make sense. And if you've never had your home monitor's accuracy checked against the one at your doctor's office, that's worth doing at your next visit. Bring the monitor with you if you can, or simply ask the nurse to compare your device's reading to theirs, taken close together. A validated monitor is the foundation everything else in this video depends on, because even perfect technique can't compensate for a device that was never accurate to begin with. It moves throughout the day in a fairly predictable rhythm, and almost everyone measures it without accounting for that rhythm at all. What most people don't know is that blood pressure is often at its highest in the first hour or two after waking, a pattern tied to the body's natural release of stress hormones that helps get you up and moving. Take your reading the moment you roll out of bed, and you may see a number that looks alarming compared to how you feel later in the day. Not because anything is wrong, but because you caught your body at its daily peak. Caffeine complicates this further. A cup of coffee can temporarily raise blood pressure for 30 minutes to an hour in many people, so a reading taken right after your morning coffee is measuring caffeine's effect as much as your baseline health. The same goes for exercise. A walk, gardening, or even climbing stairs shortly before a reading will show your body still working to bring itself back to rest, which isn't the number your doctor actually wants to see when adjusting medication. There's one detail most people miss entirely. A full bladder can raise a reading by a small but measurable amount, and it's such an easy thing to control that skipping it feels like leaving points on the table. The most reliable approach, and the one most guidelines actually recommend, is measuring at roughly the same time each day, often morning and evening, after using the bathroom, before caffeine, and before exercise. Sitting quietly for 5 minutes first. Consistency and timing does something almost as valuable as accuracy in any single reading. It lets you and your doctor see a real trend instead of a scattered handful of numbers that don't tell a coherent story. If you keep a log, even a simple notebook by the monitor, write down the time along with the number. Patterns. Stress deserves a mention here too, because it's easy to forget. It counts as a timing factor just as much as coffee or exercise does. A tense phone call, an argument, even rushing to get the reading done before you leave for an appointment can all nudge the number upward in the moment. This doesn't mean a single stressed-out reading is meaningless. It's simply one more reason a pattern over days and weeks tells a more honest story than any single measurement taken in isolation. If you notice a reading spiked right after something upsetting happened, it's worth noting that context next to the number rather than assuming it reflects your everyday baseline. Temperature can play a role as well, something almost nobody thinks to mention. Temperature can play a role as well, something almost nobody thinks to mention. A cold room can cause blood vessels to constrict slightly, which may nudge a reading upward compared to measuring in a comfortably warm space. It's a small effect, but it's one more variable worth keeping consistent. Measuring in the same room, at a similar temperature, adds one more layer of reliability to the pattern you're building. Almost everyone over 60 has heard cut back on salt so many times it barely registers anymore. But here's what most people don't know. The salt you add at the table is usually a small fraction of your actual sodium intake. The majority typically comes from processed and packaged foods. Canned soups, deli meats, frozen dinners, bread, condiments, and restaurant meals, long before a salt shaker ever enters the picture. You can throw out your salt shaker entirely and still be eating well above what's recommended if you don't look at labels. This is where a scenario probably sounds familiar. You've been proud of yourself for years for not salting your food at the table, genuinely believing that habit alone was doing the job. Meanwhile, a single serving of canned soup or a couple of slices of deli turkey can quietly account for a third or more of a full day's recommended sodium limit. It's not a failure of willpower, it's a labeling problem, and processed food is simply built around sodium as a preservative and flavor enhancer in ways that aren't obvious from taste alone. The surprising part is that reducing sodium doesn't require perfection, and it doesn't require bland food. Cooking more meals at home, choosing low-sodium or no-salt-added versions of canned goods, rinsing canned beans and vegetables before eating them, and leaning on herbs, citrus, garlic, and vinegar for flavor can bring intake down substantially without turning meals into a chore. Reading the nutrition label for sodium per serving and checking how many servings are actually in what you're about to eat is often more useful than any single food rule, because it puts the real number in front of you instead of a guess. It's also worth remembering that sodium sensitivity varies from person to person, and some people see a much bigger blood pressure response to salt than others. This is exactly the kind of detail worth bringing up with a doctor or dietitian, especially if you're also managing kidney function or take a diuretic, since sodium and fluid balance interact closely with how those medications work. Restaurant and takeout meals deserve their own mention. since they're often the single largest sodium contributor in an otherwise careful week. A dish that tastes no saltier than something homemade can still carry several times the sodium, simply because commercial kitchens season heavily and consistently for flavor. This doesn't mean eating out has to disappear from your life. Asking for sauces and dressings on the side, choosing grilled over breaded or cured options, and treating restaurant meals as an occasional event rather than a daily habit can make a meaningful difference without turning dinner out into a source of anxiety. There's also a broader pattern worth understanding. A diet that's genuinely helpful for blood pressure isn't only about subtraction. Foods rich in potassium, things like bananas, potatoes with the skin on, beans, and leafy greens, support the body's own ability to manage sodium and fluid balance. This is exactly the kind of detail worth discussing with a doctor before making major changes, particularly for anyone on medications that affect potassium levels, since more isn't automatically better in every individual case. The larger point stands, though, framing this as what to add alongside what to reduce tends to be far more sustainable than a purely restrictive mindset, and it's part of why a registered dietitian can be such a valuable resource for translating general guidance into a plan that fits your specific health picture. This next one catches almost everyone off guard. Two people can take the exact same blood pressure medication at the exact same dose and get noticeably different results. Not because one person's body responded better, but because of when during the day they took it. Some blood pressure medications work best taken in the morning. Others are more effective or better tolerated in the evening, and this can depend on the specific drug class, your personal blood pressure pattern throughout the day, and other medications you're taking. This is a conversation to have directly with your doctor or pharmacist rather than something to guess at or change on your own, but knowing the question exists is often the first step people never take. Missed and doubled doses are another quiet culprit. Forgetting a dose and then taking two the next time to catch up can cause a bigger blood pressure swing than simply continuing on schedule and mentioning the missed dose at your next appointment. Pill organizers, phone reminders, or simply keeping the bottle somewhere you'll see it at a consistent moment in your routine, next to your toothbrush by the coffee maker, solve this more reliably than willpower alone. There's also a mistake that has nothing to do with timing, not telling your doctor about over-the-counter medications and supplements. Many common pain relievers, decongestants, and even certain herbal supplements can raise blood pressure or interfere with how well a prescription works. A viewer might not think to mention the occasional decongestant for a cold or a daily herbal supplement a friend recommended, simply because it doesn't feel like real medicine, but it absolutely counts in this conversation. And here's a detail almost nobody raises unprompted. Running low on a prescription and stretching the days between refills, or stopping a medication because you feel fine, is one of the more common reasons blood pressure control quietly slips. Feeling fine and having controlled blood pressure are not the same thing. That's part of what makes hypertension so easy to underestimate, and it's exactly the kind of pattern worth flagging directly with a doctor rather than adjusting alone. Side effects are another place this quietly plays out. Some people experience something mild and manageable, like a slightly dry cough or a bit of dizziness when standing up too fast, and simply stop taking the medication without mentioning it at their next appointment, assuming there's no alternative or that it isn't worth bringing up. In reality, there are often multiple medication options within the same class, or adjustments to dose and timing, that can resolve a side effect without giving up on blood pressure control altogether. The mistake is staying quiet about it instead of treating it as useful information for your doctor. It's also worth remembering that grapefruit and grapefruit juice interact with certain blood pressure medications in ways that can meaningfully change how much of the drug is actually active in your system. This is a narrow but genuinely important detail for a subset of viewers, and it's exactly the kind of question a pharmacist can answer in under a minute when you're picking up a new prescription. Simply asking, "Does this interact with anything in my diet?" takes the guesswork out of it entirely. Here's the last piece, and it ties everything together. Even someone doing all four things above correctly can still end up with a misleading picture. If they only measure occasionally, or only when they're anxious about it. Almost nobody realizes that a single reading, even a perfect one, tells you far less than a pattern of readings over days and weeks. One high number after a stressful phone call, or one low number after a good night's sleep, doesn't define your blood pressure. The trend does. This connects to something called white coat effect, where blood pressure runs higher in a doctor's office simply because of the stress of being there, and its lesser-known opposite, sometimes called masked hypertension, where readings look normal at the doctor's office, but run higher at home in day-to-day life. Neither pattern is something to self-diagnose, but both are strong reasons why a consistent home log, brought to your appointments, gives your doctor something a single office visit never can. You might have noticed this yourself. You feel calm, you feel fine, and then a reading comes back higher than expected, and it's tempting to write it off as the machine being wrong or just today. The healthier habit is treating each reading as one data point in an ongoing story rather than a verdict, logging it, and letting the pattern, not any single number, guide the conversation with your doctor. Many guidelines suggest a short, structured stretch of home monitoring, often something like a week of twice-daily readings, before a doctor's visit where a treatment decision is being considered, precisely because a concentrated block of consistent data is so much more useful than scattered readings collected only when something feels off. Bringing that log, whether it's a notebook or an app export, gives your doctor something to actually work with, rather than asking them to make a judgment call off a single number taken under uncertain conditions. That shift in mindset, from reacting to one reading to reading the trend, is often the single most protective habit in this entire list, because it's the one that makes every other correction visible. Fix your posture but never log anything, and you'll never know if it actually helped. Fix your medication timing but only check sporadically, and the improvement might go unnoticed for months. Consistency isn't the flashiest mistake to fix, but it's the one that lets you actually see the results of everything else you've just learned. So here's where that leaves us. None of these 7 mistakes are about carelessness. They're about a system, your cardiovascular system, that's far more sensitive to ordinary daily details than most people are ever told. How you're sitting, what time it is, what's hiding in a can of soup, when a pill actually works best in your body, and whether you're looking at one number or a pattern. The good news, and it is genuinely good news, is that every one of these is fixable starting with your very next reading. You don't need to overhaul your life tonight. Pick one. Maybe it's finally checking your cuff size, maybe it's moving your morning coffee after your reading instead of before, and let that be this week's change. If you caught yourself nodding along to more than one of these, tell me in the comments which one surprised you the most. I read every one, and it helps me know what to cover next. And if this helped make sense of numbers that used to feel confusing, consider subscribing, because there's more of this kind of clear, practical health guidance coming. Take care of that heart of yours. It's the only one you've got, and it's clearly working hard for you already.